Hello guys, this is Christian from Germany. Today I'm gonna show you a secret opening against first c4 from white, especially against the English opening and also Catalan opening. Maybe can transpose to Queen's Gambit declined. So I hope I can help you with this video, and I think it's very interesting because it's a secret opening. Many of your opponents will be surprised from that. So yes, please watch and enjoy. It all starts with pawn to c4, e6, and from here white has two choices, g3 or knight to c3. I have to mention that after knight to c3, we can go to the Queen's Gambit declined after d5, d4, knight to f6, and if you play this opening, you have to learn or to study also the Queen's Gambit declined. So let's go back. We have a look at the second move from white with pawn to g3. Then we have pawn to d5, bishop to g2, and the g6 move. And from here it's really important to look where the knight on g1 is going, because this decides the structure we're gonna play. Let's have a look. At first we look at the move knight to f3. If this will happen, we can just play our standard setup with bishop g7, castling, knight to e7. And from here, after pawn to d3, we have English opening. I think it's quite more easy to play as a black one. That's the reason why we just look at pawn to d4 Catalan opening. And this we're gonna analyze in detail now. At first, we're gonna talk about the main moves in this variation and the structure we want to have as black. At first, we want to play knight to c6, we want to play castle on the king side, we want to play pawn to h6, preventing any knight g5 ideas. And later, we want to push pawn to e5, if this is possible, and placing the bishop on e6. And then we can start maybe a king side attack. In general, this is the plan for black we have to understand. And now back to the game. Let's continue with knight to c6. And by the way, sooner or later, it's not a good idea to develop the dark square bishop on f4 or g5. I can show you that why. Let's say to a g5, then we have h6, we're asking the bishop, and he has nothing better to do than retreating to the c1. So that's not really sensible. And also the bishop to the f4 is also not really good, because you can see this, castling, we have knight to c3, and maybe a pawn captures on c4. And two plans will be logical for white, but both of them are very bad. You can see this with knight to the b5. It seems that the pawn on c7 will be hanging, but on the following continuation you can see that this is a big blunder for white. And black is the full piece up. So let's go back. It also doesn't work with the move rook to e1, which seems to be very logical in the position. But then we can win a pawn with knight captures on d4. Because after knight takes, we have e5 and a double attack on the bishop and the knight. So this is not possible. So let's go back to move number 7. Now I'm gonna show you two different kinds of game. The first game, when white plays an exchange variation and exchange the pawn on d5. I'm gonna show you at first, yes. Knight to c3, then castling, and we have cd5 and ed5. I said before, bishop to f4 or g5 anyways is a very bad idea. More or less, white has to play pawn to e3. And then, very important move, pawn to h6. This prevents any knight to g5 ideas, because maybe later we want to placing our bishop on e6, and this is a really important piece for us. So logical moves are rook to e1 maybe, rook to e8, and now bishop d2 and knight to e5. This knight to e5 is a really strong piece from us, because it stops anyways pawn push to e4. And that's, in general, that's the plan from white when he plays rook to e1. So let's see. Pawn to e4, we have d captures e4, knight captures e4, and you can see we're just winning the d pawn, and black is definitely better. Let's say white plays the best move, rook to c1, but then we can push pawn to a5. We just want to go with this knight on c6 to the b4 and making some noise. Okay, then we have queen to b3, keeping an eye on the b7, also attacking d5 twice. Then we have knight b4. On the one hand, we are just defending twice the d5 pawn, and on the other hand, we have to fork with knight to d3. So we have bishop f1 defending. And then after knight to e6, I just want to mention that knight takes d5 is not possible because bishop e6 is pinning the knight now, and it's winning position now for black. So it's not possible to capture this pawn on d5. And the following continuation will show you that this is completely equal position. I just play the moves for you. So that's the end of the day. So it's completely equal position, and you managed to have a solid game and a solid opening from here. And yes, that's one of the most critical lines for black now, when white plays very correctly here. But I think in the most of the games, this will not come for you. I hope so. Okay, what do we want more as black? Let's go back into move number 7. After pawn to e3, now we have castling, knight to c3, and here the difference between the game before, we take the pawn on c4, decaptures on c4, and the main move to gain this pawn back is queen to a4. We have knight e5, queen captures, knight to d6 with a tempo on the queen. Maybe we have queen to d3 or e2, maybe d3, and we just play pawn to e5 and can equalize the game. Because after takes, and bishop takes, and you can see it's completely equal game now. Let's go a big step back into move number 4. When I told you it is a huge difference if the knight on g1 is going to f3 or to e2. If we play now the standard moves after pawn to e3, it's really bad for black. And you can see this. Here, standard move, bishop g7. We have knight on e2. Then knight e7, castle. The correct move will be pawn to c6. I will show you very soon. But at first we look at the mistake, positional mistake, knight to c6. Okay, then we have pawn to d4, Katalan opening. We have castle, and now he can exchange the pawns. So c captures d5 and e captures d5. And from here, this pawn is more or less isolated at the moment. And he can get use of that. At first, knight to c3 attacking the pawn. Then maybe standard move, pawn to h6. There are all the standard moves we played in the games before, but in this kind, when the knight is on e2, it doesn't work. Because white has this move, and this is knight to f4. He is attacking this pawn 3 times, can only defend it 2 times. So forcefully enough, we have to play bishop to e6, but then he can capture the bishop. And after pawn to b3 and so on, it's a really bad position for black. We cannot have really good counter game. We cannot push this pawn to e5, and the pawn on g6 is weak. It's a really sad position. Computer gives plus 1.6 for white here. So that's the reason why we have to look where the knight on g1 is going. Let's go back into move number 6. Now I can show you how you play this correct, this position, when the knight is on e2. The very important move is pawn to c6. And in the next move, I just show you how you should build up your setup, and you go for a very, very comfortable opening. So it's kind of a Catalan opening structures, and it's very easy, if you remember these moves, to go for an equal game with black. And we don't have a really strong plan. We just wait if white makes any mistake, and maybe we can go for an advantage or for the full point. So now I can show you a few mistakes for what we can wait with black. At first we look at the move pawn to g4, but what is wrong with this move? I can tell you that this is knight to h4, attacking the bishop, bishop h1, and now asking the pawn to h5. Pawn captures, queen check, knight g2, and then we can open up the position maybe with pawn to e5, let's say pawn captures, knight captures, and you can see the whole on f6, on f3. This is just much better for black. Let's see, another mistakes where you can look for is maybe sooner or later he can push pawn to e4, but then yes, we're just winning a pawn, so he can never ever push pawn to e4, I think, in this positions. So the last maybe is pushing pawn to c4. I think this is a tricky one. You can see this because after b takes c5, and now a tricky move, queen to a5, double attacking on one side the bishop, on the other hand the pawn. So bishop has to go back, and we are just grabbing the pawn maybe. And black is much better now in this position. At least before we come to an end, I have to show you what will happen at move number 6 if your opponent plays pawn to d3, instead pawn to d4. Pawn to d4 is a Catalan opening setup, so that's what we talked about. But now I'm gonna show you what you can do after pawn to d3. And for this I decided to show you a very instructive and very cool game between two international masters, Jonathan Karlstedt from Germany and Fries Nielsen Jens Ove from Sweden. I think this game can inspire you a lot, and yes, it's a very cool game, especially from black. At the end game, not really for 100% perfect, but it's very instructive, and you can learn very much from this game. So please watch and enjoy this. And from here it's a draw. Black cannot push the g-pawn, he can also not push the c-pawn to the c1. So this is completely a draw.